Good morning. Welcome to our conference, the U.S. Republic of Korea Alliance After 70 Years, Legacy and Trajectory. It's my honor to begin today's proceedings. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Byrne. I'm the President and CEO of the Korea Society. This conference represents the partnership between our two nations. That's why we are delighted to partner with the Consulate General of the Republic of Korea in New York City, and I want to express our appreciation for the leadership of Consul General Whan Kim and his incredible staff. Thank you as well to Foreign Minister Park Jin for providing video remarks, and to Foreign Ministry Deputy Director General Soo-Young Kang for joining us today, and then she came all the way from Paris yesterday. We are also delighted to welcome New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy to today's conference. Thank you for taking the time to come here today, Governor. And thank you for Princeton University for your hospitality and cooperation. It's hard to think of a more suitable venue for a conference like this. A special thank you to Princeton University Vice President for Facilities, Whan, for coming today. I also want to thank a few other friends for coming today to show their support. First, welcome to our friend New Jersey Assemblywoman Ellen J. We've gotten to know each other over the past year or two. It's very nice to see you again. And of course, our good friend Ambassador Susan Elliott, President and CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. Before I introduce Governor Murphy, it's worth recalling that when the Korean War began in 1950, there was a wide gulf between the two countries. They were separated geographically by the vast Pacific Ocean, and cultural and commercial connections were relatively scant. Words engraved on the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. Capture this situation quite well. Our nation honors her sons and daughters who answer the call to defend a country that they never knew and a people they never met. But how did the two peoples establish what has become an enduring relationship from such a tenuous beginning? The answer, at least in my mind, is that it was the Korean War, which became a crucible, a severe trial that created something new, in which tragedy and sacrifice were transformed into a strong bond between the two peoples. General James A. Van Fleet, the longest-serving commander of the U.S. Eighth Army and the UN forces in the Korean War, formed a sense of commitment to the American-Korean relationship, and did not want Americans to forget Korea when he returned to civilian life in 1953. So in July of that year, he launched the $5 million American-Korean Foundation Fund for humanitarian emergency aid to help the people devastated by war. By way of reference, $5 million in today's money is about $50 million. After serving as chairman of the American Korean Foundation Fund in the mid-1950s, Van Fleet yearned to build an organization dedicated to more than fundraising for humanitarian needs. In a meeting with ROK President Syngman Rhee in March 1957, Van Fleet raised the idea of creating a new friendship organization dedicated to strengthening ties between the people of the United States and Korea for the decades to come. Rhee was enthusiastic and went so far as to make the American general promise to form such a group. And so the Korea Society was established in late 1957 in New York City. For more than 6 decades, the Society has carried on its mission to promote awareness, understanding, and cooperation between the peoples of these two great nations. Today's conference includes keynote speeches, welcoming remarks, and 2 panels. The first panel examines the origin and future of the U.S.-Korean alliance relationship, and the second explores the roles of Korean Americans in that relationship. Now, it's my great honor, to introduce New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy. Governor Murphy first took the oath of office in 2018, and again for a second term in January 2022 as New Jersey's 56th governor. He is the first Democratic governor to serve a second term in 44 years. Prior to becoming governor, he served as the United States Ambassador to the Federal Republic of Germany from 2009 to 2013. Governor Murphy has been deeply involved in works with local community development associations and among many endeavors, including task forces such as co-chairing a national task force on public education in the 21st century for the Center for American Progress. Before entering public life, Governor Murphy worked for over 20 years at Goldman Sachs, starting as an intern in 1982 and ending in 2003 as a member of the firm's management committee. During his business career, he led offices in Frankfurt, Germany, and Hong Kong. Please help me welcome to the podium Governor Phil Murphy.
Thank you. Tom, thank you very much for your gracious, I don't know what happened to Tom. Thank you very much for your gracious words and introduction. We were in John Corrado, thank you for your policy leadership. We were discussing outside, and you mentioned that I was posted in Hong Kong, and part of my responsibility was doing business in Korea in the late 90s. So it's a country I know well. Don Gregg at the Korea Society was a very valued counselor and advisor to me. And I might add that, like the Korea Society, I too was established in 1957. Making sure you're paying attention out there. I want to give a particular shout out to my dear friend, the Consul General Whan Kim. It is so good to be with you again. You and I and your First Lady and my First Lady had a magical dinner at your residence a few weeks ago. And please give her our best, and I look forward to many more engagements together. Am I okay? Okay, just making sure. I also want to acknowledge, as a general matter, all the dignitaries, the scholars, the distinguished guests with us today. Susan, I'd single you out. To all of my Princeton buddies, I went to Harvard, so please don't hold that against me. But I am, by virtue of my position, ex officio a member of the Princeton board. Therefore, that gives me the ability to wear a Princeton tie. Our son Charlie, knock on wood, please keep him in your prayers. God willing, will be graduating a week from Tuesday from Princeton. Charlie has finished his thesis and his last exam, and I can promise you he's still in bed. But to everybody here, I am incredibly honored to be with you. He's not here in person, but Park Jin, otherwise known as PJ, has become a very close friend. He's an outstanding foreign minister. We were together most recently at the White House for the state dinner. I'll come back to that in a moment. And we were also together at the Munich Security Conference. So I know he's not here, but I want to acknowledge him. And I also have to give a particular shout out to my buddy Ellen Park, who is not only a dear friend, but an outstanding elected official, and the first Korean woman ever elected to our state legislature. So, thank you all. As we are commemorating, as Tom said, the 70th anniversary of the alliance between the Republic of Korea and the United States of America, I think it is particularly fitting that we're here at Princeton University, where, as you all know, better than I, South Korea's first president, Syngman Rhee, earned a PhD in political history. And we're gathered in a lecture hall, I believe, that is named after him, no less. Whan gave me a very cherished biography inscribed as Syngman Rhee, which is on my nightstand back home, and that touched me deeply, so thank you. It was also on this campus, I might add, where another great South Korean leader, former UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, said it was President Woodrow Wilson's, and I quote, President Wilson called for self-determination that, again quoting him, inspired the Korean people to fight for their independence from colonialism. And as we all know, Woodrow Wilson was not only President of the United States, but President of Princeton University and the governor of the great state of New Jersey. So this campus, like so many other corners of our state, speaks to New Jersey's long connection with the Republic of Korea. And as well, it speaks to the power and potential of that relationship. President Rhee's time here is part of a great American tradition where people cross oceans to find opportunities on our shores. Some, like President Rhee, ultimately return home, changed by their experiences for the better, and in turn shape their communities as he did so mightily. While others, like Ellen and her family, came and made New Jersey their home and have enriched our communities with their contributions. That is the extraordinary relationship that we are here to honor today. That bond was first forged, as Tom said, through blood and sacrifice. Nearly 200,000 New Jerseyans risked their lives to defend South Korea's freedom, and sadly 589 paid the ultimate price. But through, and again Tom referenced this, through the crucible of war, our relationship has deepened and grown to touch every aspect of our lives over the past 7 decades. As the proud home to the third largest Korean American community in the United States of America, there are very few places where that relationship can be seen or felt more clearly than in New Jersey. Whether it's feasting on Korean delicacies in Leonia or relaxing at a Korean spa in Palisades Park, which I would like to check out, by the way. I have to leave at 10:30. I apologize for that. I will not be headed to the spa. Or maybe singing karaoke in Fort Lee. I'll come back to that in a moment. We've even had the privilege of hosting the world's biggest boy band, the K-pop superstars BTS, not once, but twice in New Jersey. And I hear they were dynamite. I want to make sure you know I'm keeping up on BTS. And by the way, as Whan knows, this summer the band Twice is playing at MetLife.
I recall.
You're coming. I thought you were performing. And Blackpink is playing to 2 sold-out MetLife stadiums this summer, which is about 120,000 people, if you wonder whether or not there are any roots culturally or otherwise in New Jersey. Meanwhile, on Capitol Hill, our state is proudly represented by another dear friend, Congressman Andy Kim, who's our nation's 2nd ever Korean American member of Congress and the 1st in 20 years. Our Korean community has given so much to our state in every field of human endeavor. And it is another reminder that our greatest strength is our diversity. Given New Jersey's close ties to South Korea, my wife Tammy, who sends her best by the way, and I were fortunate to have been invited and attended the White House State Dinner a few weeks ago in honor of President Yoon Suk Yeol. By the way, who knew that he was such a good singer?
Nobody knows.
Nobody knew. You all, I'm sure, know this, but he belted through American Pie by Don McLean. Man, we were, from that first a long, long time ago, the whole room was transfixed. But away from music. As President Biden said that evening, and I quote the president, "We stand at an inflection point where the decisions we make now are going to determine the course of our future for decades to come." When it comes to the global stage, we're living in a precarious time with authoritarianism on the rise and too many nations competing rather than cooperating economically. And amid all of this uncertainty, our relationships matter more than ever. And as the war in Ukraine, of course, has made painfully clear. Now is the time to strengthen our bonds with our closest allies and reaffirm our commitments to one another. So we all remain steadfast in our friendship and unwavering in our support to the people of the Republic of Korea, and I pledge to work together to bring us even closer in the years to come. And as we look to the future, there is one aspect of our relationship that I hope that we can strengthen even further. It's already strong, but it can be stronger, and that is our economic ties. I know some Korean companies are in a bit of a pinch, caught in the middle of the changing global trade policies. So to them, I say unequivocally, New Jersey welcomes you. The world's biggest Korean companies, the likes of Samsung, and I still call them Lucky Gold Star, LG, and Hanwha, and many, many others, have already recognized the advantages of doing business in New Jersey, of setting up shop here, and by the way, creating thousands of jobs in the process. But I would also say there's plenty of room for more. I want New Jersey to be the first place Korean companies think of when they want to invest internationally or specifically in the USA. And I think I would say with humility that we have everything a company could want. A highly educated and skilled workforce that includes more scientists and engineers per square mile than anywhere else in the entire world. And by the way, a tip of the cap to our brothers and sisters from Princeton, because they are a big reason for that. We have direct connectivity to national and global markets. The biggest port in America, one of the best connected airports in the world. We have leading international research universities, look no further than Princeton University, and our welcoming and inclusive communities. I am hoping, as Whan knows, as PJ knows, I am hoping to travel myself to Korea this fall and make the pitch directly to multinational companies there. But no matter what happens, we are so proud of our Korean community and our relationship with the Republic of Korea. We have accomplished so much together in the past 7 decades, and I look forward to the future knowing that we will build it together. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, let's hear it for Governor Phil Byrne. Thank you, Governor. It's an honor to have you with us. My name is Jonathan Corrado. I'm the Director of Policy for the Korea Society. It's so wonderful to see you all today. So many people who I've read, so many people who I've enjoyed speaking and learning about, and even my own mother has joined for today. It's a pretty cool gathering.
Where's Mom?
Right there. Give it up for Amy Corrado. So as you know, we've got a great lineup of speakers. We're going to have a lot of fun today. Chances to eat some great food, meet some new friends, and we even have a goodie bag that the Consul helped arrange at the end of the day. So stick around for your goodie bag. I want to extend a big thanks to the Korean Consulate. We worked together in every sense of the word on this project, and in a sense we acted like a mini alliance coming together, and this is an example of what we can accomplish when we work together. Now we're going to turn to the video monitor for a message from Foreign Minister Park Jin. Peter?
Governor Phil Murphy, Consul General Kim Whan, President of the Korea Society, Mr. Thomas Byrne, Assemblywoman Ellen Park, distinguished panelists, members of the Princeton community. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to join you today through online speech. I had hoped to deliver these remarks in person, but the G7 Hiroshima Summit has kept me from doing so. But make no mistake, this seminar has an unusually special place in my heart. For it is hard to imagine a more fitting place to hold a seminar marking the 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance. First and foremost, the auditorium for this event bears the name of the historic architect of the alliance, Syngman Rhee, the founding president of the Republic of Korea. As many of you know, Princeton is where President Rhee earned his PhD. Woodrow Wilson was president of the university at the time. According to a Reader's Digest article written 70 years ago, President Wilson liked to introduce Syngman Rhee as the young man who may someday redeem Korea's independence. Indeed, Syngman Rhee would go on to become instrumental not only in redeeming Korea's independence from colonial rule, but also subsequently in defending Korea's independence from communist invasion in 1950. The cessation of fighting in 1953 was soon followed by the signing of the ROK-US Mutual Defense Treaty. This historic treaty did not come effortlessly. It was the precious achievement of President Syngman Rhee, who had strenuously opposed an armistice because he wanted to unify the country, persevering with grit to convince President Dwight Eisenhower of its need for mutual defense treaty. The intellectual nourishment President Rhee experienced here at Princeton surely helped sow the seeds. After all, it requires considerable intellectual audacity for the great leader of a war-torn, fledgling nation to seek an alliance with the most powerful nation in the world. There is another important reason why this school offers an ideal venue for this seminar. The Republic of Korea would not exist today had the United States not come to its defense in 1950. It is worth remembering that Korea had been excluded from the famous U.S. defensive perimeter announced by Secretary of State Dean Acheson in January 1950. Yet only 6 months later, President Harry Truman would make the monumental decision to send the troops to rescue Korea, even though the country had been left outside the Acheson line. President Truman's decision to intervene militarily in Korea was not driven by realpolitik or calculations of power. A moral imperative is said to have been a key factor. He was influenced by the internationalism of Woodrow Wilson. These are not my views, but those of another famous Princetonian, Professor Joseph Nye, who happened to moderate a forum during President Yoon Suk-yeol's recent visit to Boston. So in more ways than one, this prestigious institution has been intertwined with the formative years of Korea's statehood, its founding statesmen, and its alliance with the United States. Ladies and gentlemen, as most of you may have seen, President Yoon Suk-yeol made a state visit to the United States last month. It was a historic opportunity to commemorate all that our alliance has achieved together over the past 70 years. Our alliance has indeed come a very long way since it was forged. By the dawn of the 21st century, the ROK-US relationship emerged from a security-focused alliance to an economic partnership bolstered by the Korea-US FTA. It has further expanded into a global, comprehensive, strategic alliance under President Yoon and President Biden's leadership. Last month's state visit truly set our partnership on the path to the next 70 years of extraordinary success. In the face of North Korea's ever-growing nuclear and missile threat, the security pillar of the alliance was upgraded through the Washington Declaration. This declaration establishes a nuclear consultative group and dramatically strengthens extended deterrence against North Korea. It is perhaps one of the most significant strategic documents to be adopted by our two countries since the Mutual Defense Treaty. Seoul and Washington have also shown how adaptive our partnership has been in a changing world. For example, the two leaders reaffirmed that our alliance applies not only to territorial space, but also to cyberspace and outer space, committing to strengthen our cooperation in these areas. Korea and the United States will also further improve our economic security by enhancing collaboration on critical and emerging technologies. These include leading-edge semiconductors, batteries, quantum, AI, and biotechnology. Our two countries have also committed to deepening our people-to-people ties and education cooperation for future generations. Such exchanges will encompass not just STEM, but also the fields of humanities and social sciences. The two presidents also affirmed that ours is a truly global alliance that champions democratic principles, underscoring the shared values that underpin our ties. An alliance bound together by the common values of freedom, democracy, human rights, and the rule of law is vastly more resilient and enduring. Based on these shared values, the Korean government is endeavoring to actively harness its growing national strengths, both hard power and soft power, in the service of upholding the rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. The global pivotal state vision of the Yoon administration symbolizes this commitment. On many of these fronts, the great state of New Jersey, the Princeton community, and the panelists taking part today all have important roles to play. I was delighted to have spoken with Governor Murphy and Mrs. Murphy on precisely these topics when we met at the Munich Security Conference in February. As we look ahead to the next 7 decades, I know we can count on your support as we nurture paths towards an even more thriving future. With that, let me close by offering my best wishes for a fruitful and successful seminar today. Thank you.
All right, now it's time to welcome another good friend of the Korea Society to the stage. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Assemblywoman Ellen
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the Korean Society for inviting me here today to speak. And it is an honor among such esteemed leaders, including Governor Murphy, Consul General Whan, and the distinguished panelists. I extend my gratitude to President Byrne and Princeton University for hosting this momentous event. It is events like these that reinforce my belief in the mission of the Korean Society, a mission that was first embarked upon 66 years ago. As someone who has immigrated to the United States at a young age, my life has been a lesson in Korean-US relations. I embrace both my Korean and American identities, seeing them as complementary rather than conflicting. As the first Korean-American Assemblywoman elected to the New Jersey legislature, I view my role as a bridge between Korean community and the state. This means not only bringing recognition and services to our community, but also encouraging Korean Americans to engage civic participation. Rallying, organizing, voting are not only essential for our representation within our country, but also necessary to build nurturing relationships throughout the world. Active engagement with the world around us reduces a tendency to marginalize, scapegoat, or harbor hatred. Our community is still reeling from the impact of the pandemic, from the loss and social trauma that continues to metastasize. However, as we gather here today, we must recognize the strength that lies within our country, our unity. It is really through collective action that we can overcome our challenges. We are here today to recognize the importance of the alliance between the United States and the Republic of Korea and to celebrate our friendship after 70 years. Today's panel discussion provides an insight to the past and brings fresh perspective to the future relationship between our two countries and what we can do to strengthen our bond while embracing our differences. As a Korean American and as a public servant, bringing people together while embracing our differences are the words I live by. It is the diversity in our country that makes us better and that makes us the world's leader. Once again, I want to thank everyone today and cheers to a thriving and everlasting South Korea-US alliance.
Everlasting, I love it. Next up, I'm going to welcome Consul General Whan. He is not only the Consul General of the Republic of Korea, Consul General in New York, he's an accomplished author of 6 books and a global expert in public affairs policy. He has over 3 decades of experience in public service. Please help me welcome Consul General.
Thank you, Jonathan. Still, I'm an unknown writer. Nobody knows me. Good morning. For me, no coffee, no talk. So, yeah. Governor Murphy, actually, he's my best friend. I have two best friends. One is Phil. Another one is, Tammy, his wife. I like Tammy. And the Assembly member Ellen, I like her most. Now the panels and ladies and gentlemen. As the minister mentioned in his speech, today's seminar has an important meaning in reflecting on the achievements of the President Yoon, the state visit in April of this year. In this regard, I would like to thank all of the attendants for your coming today. What I'm talking about this morning is explained in the handout I already distributed. So I will talk about only two key factors. Let me read my speech as I prepared. The first one is, as everyone knows, it goes without saying that the full support of the United States has been crucial to the prosperity that Korea has achieved today. Although the support and help of the United States has been absolute in all fields, the ROK-US alliance over the past 7 years has created a decisive momentum for Korea to prosper as a free country. Taking this opportunity, once again, I would sincerely thank the United States for sacrificing over 36,000 precious lives to protect Korea during the Korean War. However, we are well aware that the ROK-US alliance has never been easy to create. This was the first case of the world's most powerful country allying itself with the world's most weakest and poorest country. So today, we are here to remember the greatness of the first president of Korea, Syngman Rhee, a great Korean and a world-class diplomat who made the Korea-US alliance possible. In June back in 1910, right here, Princeton University, President Syngman Rhee received his doctorate. The second, this is the most important part of my speech. President Syngman Rhee made the Republic of Korea the only free democratic country on the East Asian continent to exist. There are many great things about President Syngman Rhee. For me, the most important thing is definitely that he clearly penetrated the essence of communism, which no one at the time was able to properly understand. Communism is not just an ideology or a system opposed to free democracy. President Syngman Rhee was aware that communism is a terrifying ideological system that destroys human nature and causes the state to suppress and control people's free thoughts, eventually disregarding people into the slaves of state power. Even now, Korea is always facing threats by the North Korean communist forces, who are trying to make Korea a communist country. Nevertheless, we are confident that the Republic of Korea, which has achieved prosperity through the strong ROK-US alliance over the past 70 years, will continue to develop and prosper. This is not only the prosperity of the Republic of Korea, but also the hope of all free world that aspire to freedom and peace. Lastly, I hope that the ROK-US alliance will be even stronger over the next 70 years, just as over the past 70 years has led to the prosperity of a free Korea. God bless the U.S. God bless Korea. Thank you so much.
Consul General Whan Kim. We're going to start our first panel. So as I introduce our speakers, I invite you to join us. Panel. As everyone else has already pointed out, the U.S.-Korea relationship has dramatically evolved over the past 7 decades. We were veritable strangers in 1950, but now we have become brothers and sisters. As we celebrate our relationship's Chilsun, or 70th birthday, trying to impress you all with my Korean, it is striking to observe how far we've come, how much we've overcome, and what lies before us. Nurturing this relationship is the heart and soul of the Korea Society mission, or the Korea Society Organization. The purpose of today's first session is to explore the origins, legacy, and the future of the U.S.-Korea alliance relationship. To do so, we've gathered 4 amazing speakers who, their full bios on the webpage, so you can check that out, but I'll briefly introduce them. First up to join us is Dr. Kathryn Weathersby. She's a specialist in the Korean War and adjunct professor of Asian Studies at the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University. Thank you for joining us today. Next up, Dr. David Fields, Associate Director at the Center of East Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and the author of Foreign Friends. They jumped the gun on the applause. They were really excited.
I think I jumped the gun. I think I stood up too soon.
Dr. Darcie Draught, a postdoctoral research associate right here at the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs, who focuses on U.S.-Korea policy, South and North Korean domestic politics, and foreign policy. Thanks for joining us. And last but certainly not least, the moderator for this panel is our very own Korea Society President and CEO Tom Byrne, who's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University and Georgetown University. We're going to invite Tom to the stage. And before we start with the panel, Peter, over to you for a quick video. You're reading too fast and you forget stuff. Well, I just did that because I forgot a very important member of this panel, and that is Dr. Jong-woo Whan, who has taught in the political science department at Syracuse University since he got his doctoral degree in 1997. He currently serves as the president of the Korean War Legacy Foundation. He catalogs all these stories of veterans. It's such an important mission. We're so glad that he does what he does, and we're so glad that he's joined us here today. Professor Whan, please forgive me.
So thank you all for joining, and we'll do 2 rounds, and then we'll have questions and answers time. And so I'll throw out a question, throw out a pitch to all our panelists. And I'll start with Kathryn, and then go to David, and Jong-woo, so Kathryn, to begin with. Your scholarship has revealed some fascinating insights about the engineering advantages of the Korean War, especially Soviet involvement, and the complexity of the Armistice Agreement. In addition to marking the 70th anniversary of the alliance, 2023 also marks the 70th anniversary of the Armistice. Can you unpack the historical trajectory of both complicated and drawn out negotiations, and all in 5 minutes or so. A little less easy than the episode carries for us.
Thanks very much. I'll do my best. The alliance was born out of the armistice, as has been referenced already this morning, because President Rhee couldn't bear to end the war without a victory, and with the North still intact, their army still intact, Chinese soldiers still in the North. He insisted that there had to be a security guarantee from the United States before he would be willing to give the orders to the ROK Army to stop fighting. During the long lead up to the eventual conclusion of the armistice in July of '53, there was a tremendous strain in the alliance between Rhee's government and the US officials in South Korea. But what I want to talk about is the circumstances that caused the armistice negotiations to go on for so long in the first place, giving the context for such tensions to arise. We know now from the Russian archives and from East European archives that the reason the armistice negotiations went on for 2 years, very unusual for concluding a ceasefire, is that the leadership on the communist side in the Soviet Union and also in China, but first in the Soviet Union, decided that once the Chinese forces drove UN forces out of North Korea by the end of 1950, the war was safe for the Soviet Union. It was away from its border, it's away from the Chinese border. And therefore, Stalin gave a direction to the leaders of the East European communist countries that the US would be stuck in Korea for the next 2 to 3 years, which gave time for the East Europeans to build up military forces. The reason he wanted them to do that was their job was to be a buffer, protecting the Soviet Union from attack from the West, which he assumed would come. And so why did he say, this was in January of '51, why did he say the U.S. is going to be stuck in Korea for 2 to 3 years? I mean, was he psychic? I mean, that's odd. The reason is, and we know this from the records too, that he then proceeded to give instructions to the North Korean and Chinese negotiators when the armistice talks began in the summer of '51 to drag it out. Don't reach an armistice agreement. Keep this thing going. Just string it out because it's good for us to keep the Americans distracted in Korea. Of course, this came at the cost of extraordinary destruction of North Korea from bombing. It also came at the cost of extraordinary casualties along the front line during that long 2-year period. Nonetheless, that was of very little concern to Stalin. So when Kim Il-sung appealed to him early in '52 to reach an agreement, he said, "No, you need to keep fighting. It's important for the worldwide revolutionary movement." Mao also wanted to keep fighting and was happy to follow Stalin's instructions because by the middle of '51, when the talks opened, the Soviets were in the process of transforming the People's Liberation Army in North Korea into a modern army. They were bringing not only weapons, the latest weapons, and training the Chinese soldiers in how to use them, but more importantly, they were creating a modern logistics system and a modern communication system, which the Chinese forces did not have at that time. Mao referred to the Korean War as the best military school ever. And so he cycled all the units of the PLA from all over China so that they would spend time in Korea to go to school. Well, there's a lot to say about that, of course. But for our purposes today, thinking about alliance, it's difficult to imagine a greater betrayal than that. Both the Chinese and the Soviets insisted that North Korea tolerate the physical destruction of their country in order to benefit the Soviet Union and China. By the end of the war, just before the armistice was signed, North Korea began to present the war as a victory brought about only by the North Korean forces, completely ignoring the presence of the Chinese. And when you go today to Pyongyang, to the main museum there, to the war, there's no mention of the Chinese. It's a great victory brought about under the leadership of Kim Il-sung and, through the bravery just of North Korean forces. It's also worth noting that the mutual security alliance between the DPRK and the Soviet Union and the DPRK and China was not signed until 1961. The alliance we're celebrating today was signed right after the armistice was finally concluded, but neither the Soviets nor the Chinese were willing to make such an alliance with North Korea. They only did so in 1961 because of the split between the two of them. Because after there was a split between the Soviets and the Chinese, they both wanted to court North Korea so that it wouldn't go completely to the other side, and that's when they made a mutual security alliance. So my point is, trust is really important. There has never been trust on the northern side, and there is not still today. The North Koreans don't trust China, even though the 1961 alliance was renewed in 2021. They don't trust the Chinese. They don't trust the Russians. Very different picture. Yes, and I think Consul General Kim referred to this in his remarks. The shared values make for a much, much stronger alliance between our two countries. I think I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thanks for your insights. I mean, I thought I knew a little about the history of the alliance and the relationship between North Korea, but I really did know a little. So thanks for illuminating, at least my understanding. Does anyone want to comment on Kathryn's remarks, or should we anything? Just you can't suppress. Go ahead. Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Kathryn mentioned about this betrayal and distrust among the North Koreans and other Chinese and
Right.
Russian. But at the same time, that's exactly the concept that we can apply to the relationship between North Korea and the United States right now. I think we need to really build trust to bring anything into the table for substantial talk, and also the betrayal about the relationship between U.S. and Korea overall, late 19th centuries. The Treaty of 1882 and trade of Korea into Japan, division of Korea, but everything changed after the Korean War and the sacrifice of the Korean War veterans. So that's where I'm going to talk, but I thought about these two concepts that can be applied for.
Okay, that's a good prelude to your remarks. So let's turn to Dr. David Fields, who wrote Foreign Friends, Syngman Rhee American Exceptionalism, and a Division of Korea. And you explore Syngman Rhee's long lobbying campaign to get American support for Korea's independence. Can you weave that in and focus on Syngman Rhee's role, maybe leading up to the Korean War?
Yeah.
And the armistice and the alliance.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much to the Korea Society, to the Consul at Princeton University. It's wonderful for a scholar of Syngman to get to speak at Princeton University in a hall named for Lee Syngman. And thank you all also for mentioning the title of my book in your question. And your question, I think, really gives us an opportunity to highlight what I think is a very important fact in U.S.-Korean relations that's often overlooked. And that's that the relationship doesn't start in October of 1953 with the Mutual Defense Treaty. It doesn't start in June of 1950 with the American intervention into the Korean War. And it doesn't start in August of 1945 with the American joint Soviet occupation of the Korean Peninsula. As Yoon Suk-yeol pointed out in his remarks to a joint session of Congress, it starts all the way back in 1882 with the 1882 Korean-American Treaty between the United States and the Kingdom of Chosun. And having the correct starting point for this relationship is so important because there's a lot of really important history that happens between 1882 and 1953. What I like to think of as the three great tragedies of modern Korean history: Korea's colonization by Japan, the division of Korea into separate occupation zones and then separate states, and the Korean War. And in the opinion of Lee Syngman and many other Koreans of his time and many today, the United States government was at least complicit in all of those tragedies. And this is what Lee Syngman built his lobbying campaigns in the United States around, this complicity. Americans like to think of themselves as an exceptional people who like to think of their government as being on the right side of history. And so Lee Syngman made a career of touring around the United States and telling the American people that that, in fact, was not the case. So, for example, if the United States had abided by its obligations under the 1882 treaty, it should have opposed Japan's colonization of Korea. And he started encouraging American people to pressure their government to then change its policy. Now, he believed that such opposition would have prevented the colonization of Korea. I think Lee Syngman was wrong about that. But nevertheless, that is what he argued, and he convinced many Americans that that was, in fact, the case. During World War II, and he never tired of pointing this out, had the United States listened to him and recognized the Korean Provisional Government in exile in China, a government that had a history going all the way back to the Samil-Undong in 1919, there was a good chance that perhaps the division of Korea could have been prevented or maybe overcome. And he built a large coalition of American supporters based on this belief. And then finally, after the outbreak of the Korean War, he never tired of pointing out to American audiences that had the United States not withdrawn its forces from Korea in July of 1949 without any explicit security guarantees for the ROK, then perhaps the Korean War could have been avoided. And so Rhee really built his lobbying career on this set of grievances. And Rhee is remembered as pro-American, and that's largely correct. But actually, almost every American official who had to deal with Rhee hated him because of his constant bringing up of these grievances and really trying to use the American people over the heads of American diplomats to pressure the American government. They hated him for that, and he hated them. Where Rhee really was pro-American, and what he had a real genius for was connecting with the American people, understanding the ideological tools that were available to him. I think Rhee learned very early in his time in the United States, perhaps here at Princeton, that there's nothing more American than accusing the federal government of either malfeasance or incompetence. And he did this for 50 years and made many friends in the United States by doing this. And he discovered that he could use these tactics to create a coalition that could bring pressure on various administrations, from the Roosevelt administration, the Wilson administration, the Roosevelt administration, to the Truman administration, to try to change American policy towards Korea. Now, unfortunately, he was almost never successful in changing policy to what he wanted it to be, with one exception, and that was the 1953 Mutual Defense Treaty. This was not something that the United States wanted. In fact, I think many people in this room probably know, in 1952 and then again in 1953, the US government seriously thought about supporting a coup to remove Lee Syngman from power. And every time they decide not to do it for a number of reasons, but one of the important factors is Rhee's domestic support in the United States and how much blowback they would get from his supporters had they had done this. So I think it's quite accurate to view the 1953 treaty as something that Lee Syngman actually extracts from the Truman administration. It is not an alliance that they want to give, but it's his support in the United States that protects him from being removed, and his very credible threat to restart the Korean War if he doesn't get it, that ultimately forces the Truman administration to make that concession. And for many decades, it's not an alliance that American officials are particularly proud of. But it is the same alliance that has evolved and developed over time into something much greater than an American concession to Lee Syngman or than just security guarantees for the ROK. It's really evolved into something that is about shared values and a shared vision. So I think understanding this prehistory of the alliance is so important to understanding how it develops. But it also, I think, is important in understanding something very important about the relationship that it exists today. Because if you think the relationship starts in June of 1950 or October of 1953, and that's your starting point, I think it's hard to understand some of the ambivalence and mixed feelings about the alliance that exists on the Korean side. Where if your starting point is 1882 and moving forward, then you have a very different conception of the alliance. I think you can understand these doubts a little bit better. And I think we're seeing this today with what in the ROK is a lot of interest in and ostensible public support for an ROK nuclear weapons program. Something that both President Yoon Suk-yeol and Joe Biden had to address during the state visit here. And now I don't think the US ROK alliance is unique in having these kinds of trust issues. I think all alliances have these kinds of trust issues. But what I think is important to understand is that the particular issues in this relationship are rooted in this very specific history that I think needs to be better understood.
I mean, that's really fascinating, I think. So where were Syngman Rhee's pockets of support in the U.S.? I mean, where was the pushback on American foreign policy?
It was really broad-based, but it was largely based on Presbyterian and Methodist Christians. The same networks that sent American missionaries to Korea, Lee Syngman, in a sense, was able to reverse engineer to get to the United States and then to tour all around the United States speaking to these bodies. So one of the first lobbying organizations he founded, the League of Friends of Korea, had chapters in 16 cities all across the United States, and places like Washington, D.C. and New York, but also places like Findlay, Ohio, Ashland, Ohio, areas in the homeland. And I think he was able to generate really what was an American interest at the time in Korean Christianity and transform that into ultimately sympathy for the ROK, although it was a very, very long, very tortuous process for him.
Did any of that translate into support in the U.S. Congress?
Absolutely. There was a vote. There is a reservation to the Versailles Treaty that says the United States will ratify the treaty with the understanding that it has the right to support Korean independence going forward. And it was proposed by a member of Congress who was also a member of the League of Friends of Korea. And this vote fell just 7 votes short of passing. Now, ultimately, it would have made no difference because the United States doesn't ratify the Versailles Treaty anyway. But there was a vote about Korean independence in the U.S. Congress in 1920. And then there was World War II is a whole other issue. But there's also congressmen speaking out on the floor in June and July of 1945 and reading from scripts that are written by Robert T. Oliver, who is Rhee's ghostwriter, that these remarks were written for them. So yes, his influence in Congress was quite dramatic.
Fascinating. Okay. Does anyone want to jump in here before I turn to Jong-woo? Kathryn, any comment?
No, it's wonderful to listen to David talk about it.
No, I mean, it was just remarkable listening to the outline of the early stages of this relationship and the pushback that Rhee gave, because I think that there's this narrative that somehow these kinds of pushbacks are a tension in the alliance. But just to think that it's been something from the beginning and that we've negotiated as partners, right? There have been moments of more friction, and I'll get into a little bit in my remarks, but that's something that's already been part of the alliance. That's really remarkable. And I was thinking when you said that there's nothing more American than taking the government to account for malfeasance, but I think that there's also, that's true for Korean democracy today too, right? There is that kind of shared, not just shared values, but shared democratic behaviors too, right? Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me turn to Dr. Han Jong-woo. Dr. Han is president of the Korean War Veterans Digital Memorial Foundation, and you've done some incredible work to preserve the history of the Korean War from the point of view of the veterans who fought in the war. Do you have a couple of stories that you can share with us?
Yes. Jonathan asked me to be interactive with the audience. I want to do that.
Right.
Could you draw your cell phone and type the Korean War Legacy.org, one word, and that's the stories that I'm going to share with you from there, that database. We have about 1,600 Korean War veterans interviewed, not only from the United States, but also from other 21 countries. And teachers, actually the foundation, all the people that are working for the foundation is part-time social studies and history teachers. They listen, they analyze it, they put all the metadata into it so that you can do search about the veterans that I'm going to talk about. So if you are in there, go to the main menu. First menu is interview archive. And there is a search function, and I want you to name James Stone. And while you are finding his interview, I want to put all those work that I've been doing into a perspective. As David mentioned, it's before the alliance and after, right now. And I just briefly mentioned about it, but the first encounter between US and Korea, unofficial but very official, is General Sherman, completely burned down near to the North Korean capital city of Pyongyang in 1866. And then 1871, the first Korean War that I named in my book, The Metamorphosis of US-Korea Relations, that I published last year. And then 1882, the treaty. But that treaty was really forsaken by the President Theodore Roosevelt when he was exchanging the Korean Peninsula to Japan and Philippines. And then again, his cousin, Franklin Roosevelt, had an architect of dividing Korean Peninsula. Not the Axis power, but the Korean Peninsula was divided. And that was very unfortunate, right? And still divided. And then the Korean War, the Atchison line excluded the Korean Peninsula. But now it's one of the biggest allies to each other, right? And still, we are in the middle of this fighting between exactly the same line, the Atchison line, which is now becoming global supply chain, right, between U.S. and China. And the Korean War was actually the war between U.S. and China. Many of the interviews that I heard from Korean War veterans, their enemy was not North Korea, but China. So if you find the James Stone, anybody? We need to be interactive. Wi-Fi is not here? Oh my. All right, so let me talk about his, because his interview was very stuck in my mind still. After 1 month that I did the interview, he passed away. He was the platoon leader in the early phase of the Korean War in Imjin River area, and he had to deal with so many thousands of Chinese soldiers, and he thought that he was dead. But later he found that he's still alive. He got 2 shots. One of them was in the neck, one of them in his leg. But he was surviving those because of the freezing weather, temperature, that actually stopped the blooding. And then he was dragged to the Byeokdong, the POW camp along the line of Yalu River. And he stationed there, and he came back. And I asked him, if I ask you to shake hands with the enemies of Chinese soldiers and North Koreans, if I arrange it right now, what would you do? Would you shake hands? He said, of course, of course. And I asked him again, what can we do for the reunification? He said, give something to eat to North Koreans. Trade with them. This is all about it. We're fighting against each other to live on. So do more engagement with North Korea. And at the time, in my Syracuse University, I had a project called Gimcheok University of Technology of DPRK and Syracuse University to have an academic exchange for about a decade. And that was the kind of idea. We need to build the trust with North Korea, even though there are so many misfires. But that was stuck in my mind in the interview. And the other one is Salvatore Conti. He was also the prisoner of war. And because he refused the brainstorming classes offered by the Chinese in the POW camp in Byeokdong, he was put into a small wooden box. And he stayed there for 6 months. 6 months, except 2 times for the nature's call in a day and eating. One meal a day. And he told me, if you still can find that wooden kind of prison, the model there in the internet, and he told me a lot about the sufferings of the Korean War veterans in the Byeokdong prison camp. Many died because of the lack of medical treatment and medicine and general care and lack of the meal, but also many of them actually killed themselves. They couldn't stand it. More than 20 people sleeping in a small room without any heat of the North Korean winter, and they were full of fleas coming down from the ceiling, and they had to go through those. And also, they were daydreaming the food that they used to have in America, ice cream, steak, and they refused to eat the meal that the prison camp actually provided. Maximum twice a day or 1 meal a day. So those are the sufferings and sacrifices that I was able to get from my interviews from the POW. In our website, there are more than 100 interviews of the Korean War veterans that happen to be in the prisoner of war camp in North Korea. But I want to talk about 2 topics because I have done more than 1,600 Korean War veterans interview. I think I can generalize of the interviews that they've been offering to us. The topic is about the forgottenness. Why Korean War was named as forgotten, despite such a splendid outcome from the Republic of Korea. You can name any country that came out of like South Korea after the World War II with intensive economic aid and foreign aid from the United States for the countries that got independent of World War II. Can you name other than Korea? And why is it still forgotten? And I asked that question, why is it? And I was able to get this knowledge that the Korean War veteran themselves was the one who really wanted to forget about their service in Korea. Why? Because it was so miserable. First of all, when they arrived in Busan and Incheon, they told me they were hesitating. What is the first image of your encounter of Korea for the first time? Many people didn't know where to locate the Korean peninsula in the map when they were 16, 17, and 18 years old. They never learned about Korea in their history class. And I asked them, be honest. And they say it was so smell bad because we were still using, the Koreans were still using human waste as a fertilizer. Obviously it was harbor. And everybody was poor. And children were just following them up with anything, asking for anything to chew. That was the image. And then the Korean winter was so cold, and the summer was flooded in the foxhole, in bunker. And when they left, I asked this question, had you ever imagined that Korea would become like this today? And, they shake their head. And then, have you been to Korea these days? And that's where that they stop and talking to me, Dr. Han, and then they just cry like a baby. I couldn't believe my eyes. I never thought that Korea would become like this. So my perspective is that compared to this very unfortunate encounter from the late 19th century up to the alliance and the Korean War, whole thing really changed the narratives and discourse. And I use that word and metaphor, metamorphosis. That's the title of my book. I mean, I love Bugs Life, the animation. I watch with my 2 daughters many, many times. And one of the scenes is the caterpillar becoming butterfly, right? In that transformation, I think, the sacrifice and the honor of Korean War veterans really matter there. That's why we put the Wall of Remembrance, putting their names of 36,634 of U.S. soldiers and 774 Katusas last year. So that's one thing. Can I have one more minute?
Sure.
Sure.
And that's another topic is nowhere to everywhere. And as I mentioned, Korea was nothing good for the eyes of the Korean War veterans in 1950 to 53. Now they know what's going on in Korea. So many of veterans, they say, you are the great nation. And you are the only nation that thank back us. And isn't it so natural? And they say, no, it's not. So the Korea, nothing good for them to the eyes of the Korean War veterans themselves, and they wanted to forget about it because when they came back, they were busy working on GI Bill to study and take care of their families and marry, all those things. And actually the question that they were asked is, where have you been for last 2 years or 1 year? That's ridiculous questions, right? So from nowhere to everywhere, I think I got all these direct witnesses from the Korean War veterans who were there in 1950 and 53, who are the foundations of current bilateral blood-led alliances.
Well, thank you. That's very moving stories. Okay, so we covered, I think we covered the Korean War itself, that period, and the decades before the Korean War that sets up the stage of the current relationship between Korea and the U.S. So let's turn to Dr. Darcie Draudt. You've been studying issues that affect the contemporary alliance relationship, coordination, adaptation. What should we be looking at? What are the key dynamics here?
So I'm gonna. It feels like a bit of a jump because I'm gonna have a few remarks based on what's going on today, what I've observed over the past decade, that's gonna affect the U.S. Relationship with South Korea from South Korea's perspective, and I appreciate the human element of this because I think that's my entree into understanding some of these issues. So, traditionally when we talk about the ROK-US alliance, we think about strategic objectives, we think about interoperability, we think about troop deployment, North Korea's nuclearization, but what I've been really focusing on is kind of the social element to this and the domestic political element to this. And so I want to address kind of three themes that I've observed over the past past decade, really, or maybe even 15 years. And I'm happy to answer kind of the historical trajectory that led up to these, but I want to look at party politics, changing societies, and then a brief mention of generational change that's going on in South Korea. So first, when it comes to party politics, there's this longstanding narrative that partisanship in South Korea drives alliance policy, right? So the narrative is that progressives are typically more isolationist, perhaps, or anti-American. Certainly, we saw that in the early 2000s. And then on the flip side, conservatives are very pro-American, very much about building out the alliance, for a variety of historical reasons. But I think that party politics is no longer a good indicator of South Korea's alliance policy or positions on it. During the Moon administration in Washington, there was a concern that there would be a resurgence of anti-Americanism that kind of bubbled up during the Whan administration in the 2000s. But that didn't really pan out, did it? Right? There was actually a lot of dialogue about what this means, what tension points there are. It's particularly remarkable, the alliance coordination vis-a-vis North Korea at the time, and the kind of wild card that Trump's policy toward the Korean Peninsula, asking for, more pay from South Korea. It's his kind of summit diplomacy with North Korea, and yet there wasn't the same kind of friction between Moon and Trump that we might have expected if we had looked at the lessons 10 years prior. Is that 10 years? A little bit more than 10 years prior. And then likewise, in the current administration, conservatism is changing in South Korea today, as is progressivism. And earlier the Washington Declaration was mentioned, and I think the premise of the Washington Declaration was a recommitment to U.S. extended deterrence on the Korean Peninsula, and Seoul's commitment to not pursue its own nuclear capability. Now, I think that the Washington Declaration, and we're going to get into this, I think, a lot more later, but the Washington Declaration may have settled it for now. But if you look at the reaction among South Koreans, like if you look at Korean newspapers, dailies, on both sides, on progressive side and on conservative side, there's a frustration that maybe that Yoon Suk-yeol conceded too much, that there still is reasons for South Korea to pursue its own nuclear capability. And so I think that's pretty remarkable that it's on both sides, in both pockets. So it's not really the partisan issue that we make it out to be. So to kind of rethink, well, if it's not party politics, if it's not necessarily ideology, well, how can we think about how South Korean domestic politics are affecting how Seoul approaches the alliance? So I like to look at changing society, right? And I think a big part of this is the economy, right? Economics isn't just trade deals. It's not just about geoeconomics and strategy, but it really is about how Koreans are seeing their economic livelihood. And I think that this is where the kind of everyday life comes in. So the longstanding narrative that, and it's come up already, that Seoul depends on Beijing for economics and it depends on Washington's for security guarantee is no longer the case. And I think that the big pivoting point, as many in this room would know, is the deployment of THAAD in 2016, right? 2016. 17. And Beijing retaliated when the United States deployed this particular weapon system in the Korean Peninsula. Beijing didn't like it. What did it do? It closed down Korean firms in South Korea. Chinese boycotted Korean products, Korean cultural products, Korean consumer goods, all of those. And South Korea, that left a really bad taste in Koreans' mouths, right? So the idea of China being the best place for Korea's economic future is not really the case, especially in the broader context of economic rivalry that's going on. And so finally, the last, and for the sake of time, I just want to mention briefly the importance of looking at generational change in South Korea, and certainly we can do so for the United States as well. But younger Koreans, if you look at survey data and other qualitative research that's done, younger Koreans really adhere to a values-based approach in the sense of we want to be working most closely with democratic states. So that trickles into how they see Korea's relationship with China. That there's a distrust with China. Why? Because it's not a democratic state in the way that younger Koreans see themselves, right? Younger Koreans grew up after the democratization movement. Successful democratization. They only know Korea as an economic powerhouse. They only know Korea as a global power, right? I mean, in a middle power, but it is a globally integrated country. And so I think that these have knock-on effects, right? In the United States, we're seeing it. It's not just that Americans have greater cultural appreciation, right? Certainly with cultural products, the Korean wave, movies, music, but it's also translating into action on the American side, right? More Americans are going to study in Korea. They're studying the Korean language. They're interested in working with Korean companies. So this sort of interconnectedness is actually really multifaceted now. I'm sure a lot of the diplomats and politicians in the room have firsthand knowledge of this much more multifaceted dimension of this relationship. So I'm going to stop there. I think I put a lot on the table, but yeah.
A lot on there. I just wanted to say that it's something, what I'm becoming, even what I appreciate a lot more now, particularly here in Kathryn and David, is that this notion of the right side of history and how Americans always think they're on the right side of history. Well, that intellectual construct, at least in my opinion, is actually an intellectual conceit. And there's no virtuous path, predestined path in history, rather. The central process of history is contingency, things that may or may not happen, and how leaders and decision makers respond to those events. But nothing is predetermined. There's no right side that you can be on at any particular point.
predestined or predetermined right side. At any rate, having said that, let's turn to the second round, and I wanted to bring in, flesh out more the geopolitical aspects of the American and South Korean relationship. So, Darcie, you segue to what you have mentioned about the Korean-China relationship. Looking forward, maybe I can start with you, Kathryn. How will the alliance adapt to the future, the emerging geopolitical shifts, the U.S.-China competition and rivalry? How's that going to shape the alliance?
Over the last year, it has appeared to me that the situation is similar globally with regard to the Korean Peninsula as it was in 1949 when the Chinese Civil War ended with the victory of the Communist Party and the People's Republic of China was created. That was an earthquake, right? And the whole international system had to be created around that event. That's what prompted the U.S. to draw the so-called Atchison line that was mentioned earlier. We had to recalibrate our strategy in East Asia because we had been supporting the Chinese nationalist government. Now they only exist on Taiwan. Now what are we going to do? The war in Ukraine is doing something similar. Countries are, certainly in Europe, are realigning themselves. They're strengthening the NATO alliance. It's remarkable that Finland and Sweden have joined NATO, especially Sweden. So really amazing. Just very quickly abandoned such a long and proud history of neutrality to join NATO. It also then, that earthquake creates conditions within which events on the Korean Peninsula will unfold, partly because they shape how China is going to behave. So deterrence against any kind of action by China or North Korea is demonstrated by the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So all of these things are tied together. The recent summit between Presidents Biden and Whan strengthened deterrence precisely because of this new situation. All right, North Korea is increasing its missile development. China has been increasingly aggressive for a decade. So there are a lot of balls in the air. You know, it wasn't clear in late 1949, after the establishment of the People's Republic, what would happen next. You know, there were possibilities. You know? So it's like that now. It could go this way, it could go that way. No. It's a fluid moment. So I think we're quite right to strengthen deterrence against aggression by North Korea and aggression by China. We're quite right to try to push for improved relations between South Korea and Japan in order to strengthen that deterrence. But it's up in the air. It's not clear where we're going. Yeah.
David, from your perspective, I mean, maybe we could, step back in history a bit, and the Korean provisional government during the colonization period was in China, right?
And then Chungking.
Mm-hmm.
And
Chungking later, yeah.
Did China, of course this was the end of the last dynasty in China, non-communist dynasty, and was there any influence from China on this whole period leading up to
at the end of World War II on Korean liberation movement, on Syngman Rhee himself.
Absolutely. And actually, the question of why the U.S. doesn't recognize the KPG is actually much more complicated than Rhee told American people it was, which was one of the things that alienated the people in the State Department. Because one of the reasons the United States actually refuses to recognize the KPG is Chiang Kai-shek had already forced a treaty on the KPG, essentially making them a junior partner to China, to the Chinese nationalist regime, with an eye towards possibly re-establishing a Chinese sphere of influence in Korea after the war. And when the United States found that out, it made the KPG very toxic, because they understood that if they recognized the KPG, they might start a contest for influence over the Korean Peninsula before the Japanese are even defeated. And that is the last thing that they want to do. And this is the impetus behind the Cairo Declaration, where the United States goes on record supporting Korean independence, but at some point in the future, because they didn't want the inter-allied rivalries regarding Korea to interrupt the alliance that they were holding together to fight Japan. So it was very critical of that. And it's interesting that Rhee actually lets American officials know about Chiang Kai-shek's actions towards the KPG, hoping that it will embolden the United States to recognize the KPG, to kind of cut off Chiang's influence. And instead it has the exact opposite effect. If I could just jump on your previous question, though, to Kathryn, I think so much of the future is up in the air. And a large reason it's up in the air is because the United States is a democracy with two different parties who have very different approaches. And whichever party is controlling the government in the next few decades could have a great deal of influence on our key relationships in East Asia, especially with Korea and Japan. If we have a party that values those alliances and sees them as a cornerstone for American strength, we could go in one direction. If we have administrations that view these alliances as a transaction, then we might go in a very, very different direction. And so I think at this point right now, Kathryn's right, there are so many different options on the table. But then there's also, I think, a bipartisan issue, a very important bipartisan issue. And that's right now, I worry that the test of any policy towards China in the United States is how tough does it make us look on China? Yeah. And not, is it in our own interest to do so? Okay, and an example of this is if we were following what was American interest, we would focus like a laser on the particular activities and behaviors of the PRC that we find acceptable. And we would end a pointless trade war with the PRC that really has done nothing to further our own interests. We would also be joining the CPTPP, like the ROK is interested in doing, like almost all of our other allies in the region have done. Because this is the best opportunity to confront a lot of the behaviors of the PRC that the Americans don't like in the least threatening way possible. And this is what we need to do, because we need to remember at the end of the day, the United States is a major player in East Asia, but we don't live in East Asia. We're 6,000 miles away. The ROK is in East Asia. There's nothing that they can do about that. And so a conflict between the United States and China would be devastating, and it would strike right at the heart of these alliances, where right now I think there's a general agreement with our partners in East Asia that we need to be together in our approach to China, but we don't need to be reckless. And we shouldn't be reckless. And the more reckless we are, the more we strain these alliances that are so crucial.
Darcie, you want to jump in on the China, U.S., Korea?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, everything's up for grabs. I mean, in a sense, everything's up for grabs. And just as in the United States, a change of administration can really reset our policy toward Asia, toward Korea, toward the peninsula, right? So that would happen in Korea as well, right? We see an extreme vacillation when it comes to the North Korea policy in particular. And so I think that's something that we, that's also something that the United States, as much as it wants to be a player helping shape Seoul's decision, there's all of these other forces that, as we see a changing partisanship, like I mentioned before in South Korea, that's something else that is such an important part of that mix.
Yeah. I mean, I agree with you. If it were a foreign policy objective and a national strategic objective to
have a more balanced economic relationship with China, then the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership would not have been dumped by Trump and would have been even adopted by the Biden.
And campaigned against by Hillary Clinton.
That's
Yeah.
right. It seems like other things are going on with policymakers in Washington. Are there any voices that are strongly in support of the U.S. rejoining the TPP? I'll just call it TPP. Korea wants to join, right? And I don't know if Japan has succeeded.
They have.
They have.
Okay, good. Could Korea help bring the U.S. into the TPP? Is that too much of a stretch? Go ahead. I mean, one of the gold standards of free trade agreements, of course, is the chorus. The United States Green Free Trade Agreement.
I think this is an opportunity for our alliance partners to really ground our policy in what is in our interest and what is in our collective interest. But I think this is actually probably more of a job for the American political class to be educating voters on the pitfalls of economic nationalism and the very long-term benefits of this kind of cooperation so they can pressure Congress to do this. Because right now, I think, and this came up in the Select Committee on China chaired by Mike Gallagher, that this question came up, and the answer was, right now there's no appetite in Congress for doing this, for joining the CPTPP. And the reason I think that is because they're worried about getting elected in the next cycle, but also there's no political pressure on them for doing so. And so I think this is time for really the American political class to take a long-term view. I think our Congress is taking a short-term view right now, to take a longer-term view and recognize that this is probably our best opportunity to influence China's behavior, to hold our alliances together in the way that is least likely to lead to conflict.
Great. Well, let me turn back to Ukraine and Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Maybe we could dwell more into that. Kathryn, you're an expert on this historical Soviet Union and I guess Russia's influence in the world today. How do you see this affecting the alliance?
It has emboldened North Korea, first of all. And Russia's threats to use tactical nuclear weapons have kind of given a green light, it seems, to North Korea to make the same kind of threats. However, China's refusal to decisively back Russia has pulled back and has boxed North Korea in. North Korea is moving toward Russia because of the war in Ukraine. It identifies with Russia in its rhetoric as being a country surrounded by hostile great powers bent on its destruction. Right. So, and it's one of the few, only 5 countries that did not support the UN General Assembly resolution condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So North Korea has moved quite aggressively to support Russia. Diplomatically, there's not much it can offer Russia in a concrete way.
Other than maybe some artillery shells?
Yeah, a bit some laborers. Yeah. A lot depends on the strength of the deterrence. That's partly why it reminds me so much of 1949, 1950. One of the tragedies coming out of the study of the history of the Korean War is it becomes very clear that if the U.S. had made it clear that it would defend South Korea from a North Korean attack, the Soviets would never have given a green light to Kim Il-sung. The war would never have begun, right, if it was clear that the U.S. would join in to defend the South. It only began because Stalin got the message that the U.S. would not defend South Korea. So messages of deterrence are extremely important right now. It's also extremely important that Russia lose. I mean, decisively lose in Ukraine, because that also sends a signal to China that it's not going to win in an attack on Taiwan. And a Chinese attack on Taiwan is integrally related to what happens on the Korean Peninsula. They were stopped from taking Taiwan in 1950 because of the outbreak of the Korean War. Mao anticipated that would happen. He was quite right about that. So, in a sense, from China's point of view, taking Taiwan is finishing the Korean War. You know, it was the Korean War that blocked the PRC from completing its unification of China. So, but, you know, right now the missile defenses are working above Kiev, you know, in the last days to intercept a barrage of Russian missiles. That's an indication of what could happen in Taiwan with incoming missiles from China. Yeah.
So Russia's war in Ukraine, and how is that, and the Washington Declaration. So the Washington Declaration, I've heard it described as an upgrade or an update of the alliance, because when the Mutual Defense Treaty was signed, North Korea pretty much beat the country, didn't have any nuclear weapons, but now they do. How does this, so the Washington Declaration, what do you think the long-term impact will be on, not so much on the alliance, but also on this push within South Korean body politic, loosely defined, to go nuclear? Will this influence this internal debate, or the internal maybe inchoate yearning to have nuclear weapons in South Korea? Darcie, how do you?
Yeah, I well, as I mentioned, I don't know if it's really completely quelled a lot of the voice. I mean, it didn't necessarily address all of the sorts of interests and grievances among the different interest groups in South Korea who are pushing for a nuclear capability of their own. The idea that questions about U.S. commitment, questions about U.S. interest, and I think that the big question in the mind is the China question that's looming over. What will China do in the event of anything, any contingency on the Korean Peninsula if North Korea were to attack, right? And so, you know, I actually think that this really links to the question of all eyes on Taiwan now, that I've been hearing at just such a heightened level in Seoul, in Washington, that I haven't heard of just over since Ukraine. You know, what does this revisionism cost? What would revisionism benefit in Ukraine? And I think that this is kind of the undercurrent to the questions about the nuclear debate. That's really a bigger question about U.S. commitment on the Korean Peninsula. You know, I will say that I saw something surprising the other day. I was looking through public opinion polls in South Korea, and you know, as we all know, Koreans by and large have such a high favorability of Washington. It's usually around the 80% of South Koreans have a favorable attitude toward the United States. But then there was a follow-up question that was, what confidence do you have in U.S. commitment to defend South Korea? And it was in the 60th percentile, which actually kind of struck me. That felt a little low, considering a lot of the, you know, the other indicators that we have about the attitudes toward the alliance and the beliefs of alliance behavior. So I actually think that that's something that's also undergirding this question about the nuclear capability. It's really one point that indicates a lot that's going on underneath the surface.
Good. That could be. Why don't we turn to Q&A then on that thought? So we have a full house here, so hopefully we'll get a number of questions. And we have a mic that we can go around. Does anyone want to start off? Right here in the middle.
We're coming to you.
Hello, my name is June. Nice meeting you all. One question I kind of wanted to have is that it seems that there's definitely an imbalance between the relations the Koreans have towards American alliance and what America has to Korean alliance. For example, even if let's say there were different regimes in Korea, there would be a consistent tone, consistent direction in supporting the U.S.-Korea alliance. But it seems that depending on different governments in America, maybe the entire fundamental policy shift of foreign policy might shift to more isolationism of America in general, not being wanting to be involved in foreign wars. So I feel like there is definitely an imbalance between these two relations. That even if on the Korean side we try to make sure that there is that build a sense of trust, that depending on one president who has a radically different idea of alliance could be just blown away. So how might folks, more rational minds of both sides, try to make sure that those kind of institutions withstand maybe some of these more political pressures of isolationism?
Yeah, I really like that question. And I didn't really get to talk that much in my remarks about the U.S. domestic politics, but it's extremely important. It's a different type of politics, right? Koreans in multiple areas, in economics and security and politics and diplomacy, there is kind of a consistency, as you mentioned, June. On the U.S. side, I would divide it in those kinds of issue areas differently. So on the security dimension, there's a bipartisan consensus that the United States is committed to the alliance, is committed to defense of South Korea in the event of any contingency, right? Some of the more nuances like burden sharing that came up, especially during the Trump administration, right? Asking Korea to pay for more. That would be a subset of it, but I don't think it really undercuts the idea of changing the fundamental alliance. You go on the Hill and there's a strong commitment to it. The one area that I think there is a lot of a bigger divide in South Korea, in the United States, is on the economic side, right? What sort of investments on both sides should be optimal? Where should things like production facility, right? We've seen Korea have a strong interest in introducing their production facilities in the United States in order to kind of placate some of the kind of economic isolationism. So I think that's the bigger point of potential fiction or turning point in the U.S. when it comes to partisan issues.
Yeah, in Washington, I've always accepted this, and the Korea Society is a co-sponsor of the Congressional Study Group on Korea, which we have members go over to Korea to learn about Korea once a year. But although there's this strong fundamental bipartisanship on Korean issues, the IRA comes out and completely blindsides not just the Koreans, but our other allies and trading partners in Japan, the UK, and the EU. So there is a complexity to this relationship, right? Let's turn to, hopefully we have a couple more questions, so if you do identify yourself and keep your questions question-like, in the interest of having others, giving time to others to ask questions.
Hello, everyone. My name is Syngman Rhee. I was a director for policy communication at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs before being assigned to the Consulate General here in New York. First of all, thank you very much for your insightful discussion. There are many key takeaways for me. Among these, I'd like to ask more question about the trust Professor Susan mentioned. Actually, the word trust has many different meanings, especially in the diplomatic establishment. It can be rhetoric sometimes, but it means, in individual life, it means synonym for fidelity. But my understanding of the word trust is that we have the same interpretation of the interests we have in common. So Trust in terms of alliance means that we have the same sense of threat from our enemies. At the same time, what kind of interest we can get for the interaction and cooperation. If you look at the two different countries like Israel and Taiwan, Israel, as far as I know, it doesn't have a formal treaty with the United States, but no one would deny that the United States will stay away from the Middle Eastern issues. And if you look at the Taiwan, actually there was U.S. forces in the 1950s. In 1958, the United States withdrew forces from Taiwan. Now, if you look at these two countries, we don't think that they are on the same plane. Israel, it has very strong commitment from the United States. Taiwan, it still has the commitment from the United States, but it depends on many surrounding situations. So for Korean, U.S.-Korea alliance, in the previous administration, the U.S. president toyed with the idea withdrawing U.S. forces, maybe making it a little bit decreased. But I think the alliance and the presence of U.S. Troops are two different issues. You can still have alliance without, positioning of forces in the peninsula. But I think the presence of U.S. forces is the key element in the alliance. So my question is, what is the best way for our two countries' peoples to have a same, trust about the presence of U.S. troops in the Korean Peninsula? What should they do? We don't have Syngman Rhee anymore in the United States. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's probably for the better that Lee Syngman is not president today, because I'm not sure that he would do a lot to enhance trust between the United States and Korea. But, it's a difficult question, but I think one of the things we can do is not rip the Band-Aid off these historical grievances, which I think is exactly what the Trump administration did. And it's cost-sharing negotiations, if we can call them negotiations. I mean, it seems to me that had the ROK acceded to his demands, the United States might have even been profiting off of this relationship. And that is not trust. That is not an alliance. So, I think President Trump was a real outlier in his regard from this, but his views, they found sympathy with certain segments of the American population. So I think one of the things we can do is be aware of this history, be aware where the fault lines are. That the U.S. ROK alliance is very strong. No alliance lasts forever, and so it's not broke, but we can see the cracks. You can see the cracks in any alliance, and I think they come out of this history. And I think, unfortunately, what the Trump administration did was, start hammering away on some of those cracks. And like Darcie was saying, I was expecting to see some sort of outbreak of anti-Americanism in the ROK, and I didn't. And I think that's a testament to how the alliance has developed. How, as the ROK has become more democratic, as to how there's a better recognition of American politics and understanding that politics in the United States can change, and they can change drastically. So let's not accede to this demand from Donald Trump, because there's a serious chance that he might be a one-term president, which in fact turned out to be the case, at least in 2020. Who knows about the future. But so I think one of the things you can do is know where these trust issues are and try not to hammer on them. And they're probably not going to go away. I mean, one of the reasons that Atchison didn't want to give the Mutual Security Treaty to Syngman Rhee is said, we've already sacrificed 35,000 American lives defending Korea. What stronger guarantees do you need? And Lee Syngman said, no, I need a treaty because I understand the value of treaties, especially broken ones. And he was referring to the 1882 treaty. So that treaty was not going to give Lee Syngman trust in what the United States might do, but at least was going to give him further ammunition if at some point he was going to criticize the United States government for not following through on that. But I don't think that the trust issues right now, I think they're a part of the relationship. And they're a part that probably they can't be gotten rid of completely, except with the passage of much time. But it's something that I think can fairly easily be managed.
Right. Do we have another question?
That's three.
Oh.
Oh.
So we're running out of time.
John Koch, I'm a political historian and member of the Korea Society. I'd just like to make a point, actually 2 points, with respect to the armistice. Rhee was holding it hostage to a treaty, a direct bilateral treaty, but the U.S. was reluctant because it was committed to collective security in the same way that North Korea and Soviet Union and China were had different interests at different times. So I think that's a very important point. We see that in Ukraine today, where the U.S. and Ukraine is fighting for its existence. The U.S. is thinking in terms of alliances, worldwide alliances of the democracies. The other point about you keep going back to the 1882 treaty. That was negotiated by Chinese students. That treaty read the U.S. would use its good offices. That's not a security commitment. But I'll tell you what I think needs emphasis in terms of the legacy and trajectory, which are the theme of this talk, and that is confrontations that we have to be very clear-eyed about events that took place. For example, Chun's challenge removing the U.S. His troops from the UN command, leading to the Gwangju massacre. That was really a across the bow of the alliance. Similarly, when the U.S. forced Chun and Roh to hold elections, and diplomatically, the U.S. basically intervened in domestic Korean politics and set up a presidential system that endures today. When we think about that, going back 30 years from today, we wonder, how did the United States come about to do this? Just treating Korea like without respect, let's put it that way. So please, could you address that? I think we need to document in a clear-eyed fashion how the alliance has evolved. It's evolving toward greater equity, but there have been some bumps along the way. So let's be realistic about that.
Well, that could take another hour.
Yeah.
This has been a fascinating and insightful and illuminating panel. My big takeaway is that, particularly given that looking at the alliance with the historical perspective, is that the miracle on the Han, the economic miracle engineered by Park Chung-hee initially, was not really a miracle, because if you analyze it, there were good policies, had good economic outcomes. I mean, the real miracle is that there is a Korean-U.S. alliance, given the distrust, the historical friction. So that's the real miracle, but I think that's a miracle that we should be thankful for. So thank you for your contributions, and thank you.